Hi, everyone. My name is Ibian Rivera, and I am in the Small Communities Technical Assistance Unit, and I'd like to welcome you to our third training in the Training for TA Providers series. Today's topic is environmental. The training is geared towards environmental consultants that prepare the environmental package for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund applications. Please note, our meeting is being recorded. Everyone is on mute. Questions will be taken at the end of each section. To ask a question, we're asking you to raise your hand. Can we go to the next slide, please, Gabriel? So if you're looking at how to find that, during the meeting, you can click on the icon that's labeled participants at the bottom center of your PC or your Mac screen, see number 1 down below. And at the bottom of the participant window on the right side, click the button labeled raise hand. We will unmute those with their hands raised in the order that they appear in the participant window. The hand icon will turn blue and the text below it will switch to lower hand when your hand is raised. When your question has been answered, we ask that you click on the lower hand to lower your hand. And that's how we'll take your questions. Our presenters today are Gabriel Edwards, an environmental scientist, and Lisa Machado, a Senior Cultural Resources Officer in the Division of Financial Assistance. Let's get started with our training. Welcome, everybody.
Okay, sounds good. Ibian, can you confirm, give me a mic check real quick, make sure you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Oh,
go for it.
Does anybody have any issues with sound? Can you hear us clearly? Especially Gabriel. Lisa, can you speak up so we can hear you too?
Yes, I can hear you both.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Gabriel. Welcome to this training on the State Revolving Fund environmental packages. So Ibian kind of covered this already, but this presentation is intended for environmental consultants, and it's going to cover the environmental portions of the Drinking Water and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund applications. So I'm going to just quickly go over the plan for today. We're going to cover State Water Board environmental contacts and some resources. And then we're going to go over the environmental packages, starting with the planning environmental package and then the construction environmental package. During the construction package section, we're going to discuss the important federal crosscutters that apply to the SRF program. That's going to be kind of the main component there. And then we'll talk a bit about CEQA. I'm assuming everyone is mostly familiar with CEQA. So I'm going to be discussing the nuances of how the federal requirements interact with CEQA and also the general process when the State Water Board is CEQA lead agency for a project. And then we'll just end with some general recommendations. Please ask questions. Ibian kind of already covered this, but this is going to be a pretty long presentation. There's a lot of details that will be glossed over in order to get through everything today. And I'm not going to be going through every single item in the environmental packages. So if there's a specific piece that you have questions about, please ask. During the presentation, you can email Ibian and we can go through those at the end of the presentation. We'll respond to any submitted questions. And then obviously we'll open up the discussion at the end for additional questions as well. Okay, contacts and resources. So like I said, my name is Gabriel Edwards. I'm an environmental scientist at the State Water Resources Control Board in the Division of Financial Assistance. I work in the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund Environmental Unit under Bridget Binning. And then Brian Carey is the supervisor for the Clean Water SRF Environmental Unit. Generally, Bridget's staff work primarily on drinking water projects and Brian's staff work primarily on clean water projects. And then Wendy Pierce and Lisa Machado are our cultural contacts. Wendy's the supervisor for the Special Projects Unit. Lisa is our Senior Cultural Resources Officer. So you heard Lisa a minute or two ago. She's going to step in and present some things related to cultural resources and cultural reports when we get to the federal crosscutters section later on today. If you have project-specific environmental questions, work with your TA provider to get in touch with the appropriate environmental unit. For general environmental questions or just questions about our process, feel free to reach out to any of us. We're happy to help explain things. And then just some general communication notes. Email's better right now for contacting us. We're all working remotely and it's just easier to track and respond to. So if you're asking questions about a specific project, please CC the TA provider and the State Water Board grant managers so that they're kept in the loop on the project status and what's going on. So the link at the bottom of this slide is to the DFA environmental section website. I'll show that here. This website has information about the specific environmental requirements for the drinking water and clean water programs. There's some guidance documents, links to basic CEQA info, and contact info as well. I'm going to be referring to this website a couple of times throughout this presentation. Okay, let's talk about the environmental package. So the environmental package and the required attachments include all environmental information and documents needed for a complete state revolving fund application. Depending on the scope of the TA work plan, you may be tasked with completing the entire environmental package or just with specific components or attachments to a particular package. So there are two types of environmental packages. There's planning and construction, although right now planning is only used by the drinking water SRF program. The construction package is shared by both programs, so it's identical between drinking water and clean water. And then the links here go to the forms and instructions web pages for each program. This includes links to download the environmental packages. So we're going to talk about the environmental package for planning first, since it's relatively simple. Generally, for a planning application, only 3 items are needed for the environmental package to be considered complete. Number 1 is the complete environmental package form itself. Number 2 is a notice of exemption or a CEQA document that covers the planning project. And then 3 is a project map if one's available. So note that the CEQA document or the NOE is for the planning project itself, not the eventual construction project. Most of our planning projects, at least for drinking water, are exempt from CEQA, so they're usually NOEs. And then a terminology note, when I say a complete environmental package, generally I am referring to the environmental package form itself, as well as any of the required attachments for that particular project. The first several pages of each environmental package contain instructions about how to complete each section. So for planning, this is the first 2 pages. Generally, if you have questions about how to fill out a section, refer to these instructions and they should answer your question or at least point you in the right direction. So the main goal here is to gather as much environmental information about the planning project as possible. If some details of the construction project are known, like for example, the location of the project, this is helpful to include. But if any answers are not known, maybe because the environmental work has not started yet for a particular project, please just write that in the explain sections at the bottom of the page. So I've skipped the first 2 pages of instructions here, but these are just a couple screenshots showing the planning environmental package sections that have to be completed. A quick note on the left page at the top where it says applicant. The applicant is the water system or the wastewater system, basically the entity applying for funding. So if I refer to applicant throughout this presentation, that's what I'm talking about. So there's 2 main sections here. The first is CEQA status for the planning project. So if a CEQA document or NOE covers the project, note that any CEQA documents or notices, including NOEs, must be circulated or posted at the Office of Planning and Research State Clearinghouse. And also note, if the applicant is a private entity, the State Water Board might be the CEQA lead agency. If this is the case, an NOE will not be submitted with the environmental package. We have our own templates for NOEs and we'll take care of filling it out and filing it. And then the second section here is to gather general information about groundbreaking for the planning project, what permits are required, and just other environmental information. These are the last 2 pages. There's some more questions about planning project environmental impacts on the left, and then there's a checklist of attachments on the right. Again, if answers to any of these particular questions are unknown, just please write that in the explain box at the bottom of the page. If the applicant is a private entity and there's no CEQA lead agency that has been identified, contact the State Water Board. So often the State Water Board will be CEQA lead agency in these cases. And as I mentioned, if the State Water Board is CEQA lead, no NOE needs to be submitted. We have our own templates. We'll take care of filing the NOE. That's it for planning. It's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to move on to the environmental package for construction now. This slide is an overview of the main documents needed for an average construction application. This is assuming that the project needs to meet federal cross-cutter requirements, which we'll get into in a little bit. So we need the environmental package form itself, the NOE or CEQA document for the construction project. This has the same filing or circulation requirements, state clearinghouse, county clerk. an environmental alternative analysis, unless the project is CEQA exempt, a bioreport, culture report, air quality analysis, and an official floodplain map. So we're going to go over each of these attachments as we go through the environmental package for construction. Just like the planning environmental package, instructions are included here. In this case, the first 14 pages are instructions. And then there's 5 main sections to the environmental package proper. There's general info, CEQA status, exemption info, federal coordination, and attachments. So here's the plan for going through the construction package. We're gonna go through the first 3 sections pretty quickly, since these are they're pretty straightforward. And then we're gonna spend some more time on section 4, which addresses federal crosscutters. We will be focusing on the main federal crosscutters and kind of discussing the attachments that are needed for each of them. And then obviously we'll end with section 5, which is attachments to the environmental package. So section 1, general information. This is a short section. There's only a couple points I want to make here. Again, applicant is the water system or the entity applying for funding with the State Water Board. Project title needs to match the environmental documents and the rest of the application. So technical reports, CEQA documents, authorizing resolution, etc. Everything should use the same project title. Otherwise, we have to jump through some hoops to get the titles to match later on, and it can be a bit of a hassle. So coordinate with your TA provider to make sure the project title that's being used is consistent across all the documents in the application. And then environmental contact person, this is either your point of contact or the applicant's point of contact for environmental. Basically, who the State Water Board should reach out to if we have environmental questions about the project. So this is not the point of contact at the State Water Board. For example, like my name shouldn't be in this section. CEQA status, section 2. Like the planning package, this section just outlines the CEQA status for the project. So who is the CEQA lead agency? Is the project exempt? If not, what type of CEQA document is being prepared, etc. For environmental document status, just put the current status of the CEQA document. So has it not started yet? Is it in progress? Has it been completed? That kind of thing. I mentioned circulation requirements earlier. So CEQA documents must be circulated through the state clearinghouse, and NOEs and NODs must be filed at the state clearinghouse. This is in addition to any local county clerk postings. And we need copies of all the filed documents to be submitted, such as like county clerk filed NOEs or NODs. And then a note here, public hearing or meeting requirements. So footnote 4 states that the SRF programs require at least 1 public meeting or hearing for non-exempt projects. This is a federal SRF regulation. We include it here in the CEQA section just because often the lead agency will hold a public meeting in the process of adopting the CEQA document, and that meets this requirement. However, footnote 4 is outdated currently. Drinking water projects only require a public meeting or hearing for EIRs. Clean water projects still require a meeting or hearing for all non-exempt projects. And I'll come back to this a bit later when we talk about federal requirements and how they affect CEQA. The rest of the CEQA status section is just related to project setting. So any yes answers can be referred to a specific technical report, for example, like a bio report. Just explain this at the bottom of the checklist. Section 3, CEQA exemption information. Pretty straightforward section again. Section 3 only needs to be completed if the project is CEQA exempt. It just identifies what exemption was applied. And then note some additional information to support the exemption is requested. I'm gonna come back to this as well when I discuss CEQA exemptions later in the presentation. So let's get into section 4, which contains the federal crosscutters. Section 4 of the environmental package is the largest section. It's 15 pages, and I think currently there are 19 federal environmental crosscutters in it. We're not going to focus on every crosscutter since most will not apply to every project. If you have questions about a specific one, check the instructions at the beginning of the environmental package, and that should point you in the right direction. There's a lot of links and guidance material that will help walk you through if that particular crosscutter is applicable to the project and what needs to be completed if so. So there's 4 main crosscutters for discussion today. Here they are on a list: the Environmental Alternative Analysis, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the National Historic Preservation Act. So we're talking about these 4 crosscutters because they apply to most projects, and these all require some documentation to be drafted and submitted. I'm going to cover the first three here, and then I'll hand it over to Lisa Machado to talk about the NHPA. So first up is the environmental alternative analysis. The top here on the right is the environmental alternative analysis excerpt from page 19 of the environmental package, and then the bottom are the instructions from page 4 of the environmental package. So the main thing to be aware of is the environmental alternative analysis must analyze the environmental impacts of the project alternatives. This is not covered in most engineering reports by default. So often we're referred to the engineering report, but then when we go to review it, it doesn't have any environmental analysis for the alternatives to the project. And then also note that the environmental alternative analysis is not required if a project is CEQA exempt. This is the only crosscutter where a CEQA exemption directly affects the required crosscutter document. Here is an excerpt from an example environmental alternative analysis. The alternative analysis needs to contain any alternatives identified in the engineering report for the project, as well as a no project alternative, and it should compare the potential environmental impacts for each alternative. So here on the left, you can see the alternatives are identified, including that no action. And then there's an analysis of the environmental impacts of the alternatives on the right. In this case, it was arranged by resource categories, kind of like an initial study. There's no format requirements for this document, so other formats are totally okay. This just seems like a pretty effective way to present the analysis. And again, check the instructions on page 4 of the environmental package for the specific requirements. Okay, moving on to the Clean Air Act. Here's the environmental package excerpt. I'll come back to the general conformity determination question on the right in a couple of slides. The first requirement here is just to identify the project air basin and the local air district. You can use the links here at the top to find this information. But the real important part of this crosscutter is we need this big table to be completed. So this requires the project air emissions to be calculated. You can use any calculator you want to estimate project emissions. There's a link to CaliMod above the table just because that's the most common one that we see. The 2 columns here on the right are for the emissions from project construction and operation. If you don't have the information you need to estimate the emissions, work with your TA provider, the applicant, or the engineer to get the necessary project details, like, for example, construction vehicle estimates and that kind of thing. And if a project is so small that using air quality modeling software is not possible, you can just try to provide really rough estimates here, and that should work. So for example, maybe a meter project that only needs like 2 trucks could put down less than 0.01 tons per year PM2.5 construction emissions and estimated like 0 tons per year operation emissions or something like that. You might have this information already from developing the CEQA document. If so, just please copy it over, enter it into the table here in the environmental package. Attainment status, the first 2 columns on the table. This can be found through EPA's Green Book. This link on the right-hand side shows California's current non-attainment counties. And this link is also on our environmental section website that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. Thresholds for significance for the project air basin here in the middle of the table come from the local air district. All of their websites are different. You can either dig through their website looking for the information, but the easiest way to get this is probably just to contact them and ask. And that brings us to the second part of this crosscutter, where we need to figure out if the project is subject to a general conformity determination. If the project's located in an area that is attainment or unclassified for all federal criteria pollutants, or the project's emissions are below the federal de minimis levels, the answer here will be no. So here's a link to the de minimis tables. You can compare the project emissions to these levels. Most SRF projects are below these thresholds. So usually the answer to this question is no. Okay, moving on to the Endangered Species Act. So here's the environmental package excerpt. The main thing to be aware of here is the requirement for a biological report to meet ESA Section 7 requirements. So this link here in the middle of this paragraph has guidance for preparing a bioreport to meet those requirements. If you click on that link, it takes you to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Midwest Region website. Here's the report preparation guidance. This is a really great resource. It explains what needs to be included in the bioreport, so this may be helpful to review. One of the things discussed in this guidance is the delineation of the action area for the project. Keep in mind, this should include any staging areas for construction equipment, and the entire area needs to be evaluated and surveyed. So if you don't know the location of like staging areas, for example, please work with your TA provider to request that information from the project engineer or the applicant. This guidance is also linked directly in the Endangered Species Act instructions section at the beginning of the environmental package. And I would really recommend reading the instructions on pages 7 and 8 of the environmental package as well. They go into some more detail about a few specifics for the bio report that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service guidelines do not. So like the need for official species lists to be submitted. Even if you create your own list of potential species for the project area, please submit copies of the IPAC, NIMS, and CNDDB database results. It also talks about a potential to occur table being required and what needs to be in it. The PTO table really needs to include every species identified on the official species list. So I know sometimes it's pretty clear that some species have no potential to be present. Like, for example, Delta smelt seems to show up on the IPAC list pretty far away from suitable habitat sometimes, but please just include it in the table and explain that there's no potential to occur. For consulting under Section 7, we have to route our consultation through EPA. And if we include everything on the IPAC list, it just cuts down on a lot of back and forth communication with EPA, explaining why we didn't evaluate a particular species. Okay, time for the National Historic Preservation Act. So I'm gonna let Lisa take this over and I'll advance slides for you, Lisa.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. So here's the environmental package section for the National Historic Preservation Act, also commonly known as Section 106. This first page gives you some brief guidance as to what to include to prepare the cultural report. If the project has any potential to affect cultural resources, then a historic properties identification report or cultural report will be needed to meet Section 106 requirements. If, for some reason, federal crosscutters do not apply, but the State Water Board is the CEQA lead, we would still probably request a similar cultural report, but the content can exclude the federal crosscutter language and focus only on CEQA level evaluations. The report is still needed because we need the information to fill out the appropriate sections of our CEQA documents. If the project has no potential to affect cultural resources whatsoever, such as there's no ground disturbance or no potential to affect built environment resources over 50 years of age, please have the applicant or the TA provider contact us before you prepare a cultural report. There may be an alternative in that particular situation. Next slide, please. So the guidance for preparing the cultural report can be found on the State Water Board website at the link provided here. If you forget the link, you can always just search DFA cultural report on the State Water Board homepage. The guidance will be for the first search result. Okay, next slide. The Historic Property Identification Report Guidance or Cultural Report Guidance is a brief 6-page document and is a comprehensive set of instructions for preparing the report. This document is easily accessible online and can be reviewed in just a few minutes. It should answer most, if not all, of the questions you may have regarding what should be included in the cultural report. The guidance not only discusses the report format, but also discusses the qualifications of the staff preparing the report. Typically, these reports are prepared by professional archaeologists. For an archaeologist to meet the appropriate qualifications, they need to meet the Secretary of the Interior's professional qualification standards, which typically means they have to have a graduate degree in anthropology, archaeology, or a closely related field, and at least 1 year of full-time supervisor experience in the field. However, if there's a built environment resource in the project area, then it's likely that a qualified architectural historian will need to be involved, and I'll touch on those requirements in a couple of slides. Regarding the requirements of what should be included in the report itself, I don't want to go into too much detail here because the guidance can be found online, but I do want to mention that the guidance specifically discusses what needs to be included in the report, including the following sections: the summary of findings, It needs to include a thorough description of the undertaking, including a description of any ground disturbing activities or work on any structures. It should include a delineation of the horizontal and vertical area of potential effects, or APE, which I will touch on again in a couple of slides. It should also include a natural and cultural context for the APE, which would include an ethnographic context, an environmental setting, historic context, etc. The report should also include a record search and literature review and Native American outreach. It should also include other consulting party outreach, such as historical societies. And it also needs to include an adequate field survey and evaluations of any resources identified in the APE during the inventory. It should also include the appropriate appendices depending on what's included in the document itself, but typically the appendices would include the record search results and the Native American outreach at minimum. Next slide, please. Like I said, I don't want to spend too much time reiterating what's in the cultural report guidance document, but I do want to discuss a few common issues that we have when we review some documents. This is, to give you some precautions prior to preparing documents so you know what we're looking for. First, if the federal crosscutters are applicable, then the report needs to discuss the Section 106 and HPA nexus for the projects. Sometimes we'll receive documents that only discuss CEQA regulatory language, and we need the document to discuss federal requirements for consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office. Next, I do want to point out a few precautions regarding the APE description and the APE map. The area potential effects map should be labeled as such and needs to be at a scale appropriate to the undertaking. Preferably, the APE map would include the APE on an aerial background and delineate the project footprint. Sometimes we get maps that are more appropriate as the vicinity map, where the map scale is too zoomed out from the project area to understand the scope of the project clearly. If there are cultural resources identified in the APE during the cultural resources inventory, they need to be illustrated on the APE map. The entire resource should be included in the APE, not just the portion being directly affected by the project. In the text of the cultural report itself, both the horizontal and vertical AP should be well defined. The vertical AP description should include the depth of disturbance for different project elements as appropriate for the scope of the project. The horizontal AP is typically the footprint of the project as well as any staging areas, access roads, utility locations, and anything else that may be associated with construction of the project. If there is a potential for vibration, auditory, or visual impacts to surrounding buildings, those structures should be included in the AP as well. If it is helpful for you, on the same webpage that contains the cultural report guidance, we also have a link to an AP table that will help you to organize the various components of the project and their different areas of disturbance. This may be particularly useful for complex projects with large or discontiguous APEs. Another common precaution that I would like to point out is when preparing Native American outreach letters, please include language that references the Section 106 nexus for the project and the State Water Board's involvement. Sometimes the outreach letters that we see attached to reports only include CEQA or AB 52 language. And if that is the case, the outreach letters may need to be sent again with appropriate Section 106 language. For your use, we do have a template outreach letter available at the link provided here. The link can also be found just underneath the cultural report guidance link on both the Drinking Water SRF and Clean Water SRF pages where the other environmental guidance is found. If the applicant or the consultant or the TA provider is not aware that there is a 106 nexus or State Water Board involvement until after the initial outreach letters are sent to tribes, then you can always just provide an update email to the tribes notifying them of the new federal nexus. We just want to make sure that the tribes are aware of the regulatory framework so that they know how they can consult on the project. On a related note, please submit copies of all of the Native American correspondence with the report, including the SLF search results, the initial Native American outreach letters, and any subsequent email communication with the tribes. A consultation log that documents all of that correspondence is really helpful as well if possible. In addition to that, we also like to see a copy of the complete record search results. And I know a lot of the information is confidential, and often consultants don't supply it immediately, but I'm going to discuss the way to submit those documents a little bit later. In addition to Native American outreach, Section 106 also requires public consultation, and this can be done easily by contacting local historical societies during the outreach effort. This step is particularly important if there is a historic area resource located in the APE. If you do reach out to local historical societies, please include copies of those letters or emails with the report as well. As I briefly mentioned on the last slide, another key point I want everyone to be aware of is if there's a cultural resource identified in the APE, the entirety of the resource should be included in the APE boundary and delineated on the APE map. The entire resource needs to be recorded appropriately on the appropriate site record forms and evaluated for the National Register of Historic Places, not just the portion in the APE. If you happen to have a resource located within the project area that has been previously determined eligible, please provide proof of that eligibility, such as the SHPO concurrence letter or the DOE file, the determination of eligibility file, or whatever may be available. That can also work if the resource was previously determined ineligible. On a related note, if a resource is so large that evaluation of it as a whole is beyond the scope of the project, such as a long linear resource like a canal, a railroad, or a large rural homestead parcel or something like that, then the Water Board may be able to treat those resources as eligible for the purposes of the project. But in that case, we will need information about both the potential construction effects to that resource and the integrity of the resource within the APE to determine whether or not we have an adverse effect under Section 106. Next slide, please. If there is a built environment resource in the APE that is 50 years of age or older, then that resource will need to be evaluated for the NRHP. So that means that any structures built as late as 1970 must be considered here. These built environment resources can include anything from lift stations to water tanks, well houses, canals, entire wastewater treatment plants, or any number of other facility types, regardless of their size or presumed historical significance. If such a property exists and that needs to be evaluated, a qualified architectural historian that meets the Secretary of Interior's professional qualification standards will need to do the evaluation. These requirements typically include a graduate degree in architectural history or closely related field, or a bachelor's degree in the same field and at least 2 years of professional experience. Typically, architectural historians who meet the professional qualification standards will have a graduate degree in their field. The next point that I would like to bring up is if a project area is located under existing pavement or a developed area, please include a buried site sensitivity analysis. This will help us to determine if the modern development is obscuring any potential archaeological features and whether or not additional identification efforts are necessary, such as subsurface testing. Which brings me to my next point. Monitoring is not a replacement for appropriate identification efforts, especially under Section 106. Sometimes we get reports that indicate there's high sensitivity and suggest monitoring as a mitigation measure. But in that case, the high sensitivity raises a red flag, and under Section 106, we can't jump straight to monitoring as a replacement for identification. In that case, we would typically require additional identification efforts or something like a buried sensitivity analysis that would indicate whether or not monitoring is appropriate as a measure or if additional identification efforts are needed. And lastly, please make sure that you or the applicant are submitting the cultural reports directly to the cultural staff on the project. Because the reports will likely contain confidential resource location information, it is best if they are sent directly to us for review. And that helps get around concerns for confidentiality for archaeological sites and tribal resources as well. Next slide, please. And just as a reminder, here again are the State Water Board's cultural staff contacts. I am the senior specialist that oversees compliance with Section 106, and Wendy Pierce manages the cultural staff that review the majority of the cultural reports that are submitted for review. If you have any questions about preparation of the cultural report or any other cultural resource questions in general, please feel free to reach out to Wendy or myself. We would much prefer to answer any questions you may have while you're preparing a document instead of having the possibility of needing to rework a document later after it's already been sent to us for review. We, just as you do, want to make this process as efficiently as possible. Right now, as Gabriel said, we are working remotely, so email is the best way to contact us. So please feel free to reach out with questions to me at any time. I would be happy to help. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. All right, so those were the main federal crosscutters. I'm going to wrap up now with Section 5 of the environmental package before moving on to CEQA. So Section 5 of the environmental package is a list of attachments. It's divided between CEQA documents and federal crosscutter documents. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the checklist for CEQA documents, which we'll get into in a little bit. And here on the right-hand side are the 4 crosscutters that we just discussed. And I want to highlight one crosscutter that we did not talk about, which is it's also a required attachment, and that's here. It's the Floodplain Management Official Floodplain Map. In case you don't know how to get this, I'm going to go over it really quick. This is the Floodplain Management crosscutter excerpt from Section 4 of the environmental package, and there's the paragraph that requests the floodplain map. So you just go to the FEMA link under the required documents paragraph here. This takes you to the FEMA Flood Map Service Center. You can search for project location in the box here. This will pop up a map. You just adjust the map to center on the project location, click on dynamic map in the middle of the page, and then download the map that's produced and attach it to the environmental package. And then you can check the key on the right-hand side of the map to determine if the project is within a 100-year floodplain or not, and answer the questions that are in the environmental package section. So yeah, those are the main crosscutter attachments. I would note most of the crosscutter attachments are marked if applicable. Check the crosscutter sections and the instructions in the environmental package to see if they are required for a particular project. And then several crosscutters, including the ones we discussed, have this note about if the project is CEQA exempt, the documents may not be required. So the environmental alternative analysis, that's the only crosscutter that's directly related to CEQA exemption. So if a project is exempt from CEQA, the environmental alternative analysis is not required, as I talked about earlier. If there is a limited amount of groundbreaking activity, contact the Environmental Review Unit at the State Water Board to discuss the need for bio and cultural reports. Generally, if there is groundbreaking activity of any kind, like a cultural report will probably be required at minimum, kind of as Lisa discussed. And there might be like a little bit more leeway with bio reports. In some cases, we just need enough information to support a no effect finding for Section 7 rather than a full report. But this all depends on the project. So if you think this might be the case, get in touch with us and we can help advise you. And then finally, for air quality, if there's limited construction and operation air emissions, either do your best to provide estimates in the air quality table, like I mentioned, or contact the local air district to confirm compliance and try to get us some documentation of that. Before we move on, I just want to throw this slide back up in case anyone joined late, but we've just gone through a lot of material, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email them in or write them down, and we'll open up for questions at the end of this presentation. Okay, so that covers the construction environmental package. Let's talk about CEQA now. So I'm going to briefly cover CEQA documents, but I'm going to be highlighting kind of the additional requirements that we have to meet that are not a normal part of the CEQA process that you might be used to. So starting with NOEs, we've talked about filing requirements already. We need a copy of the state clearinghouse filing and the county clerk copy. We can look up the state clearinghouse record on CEQA.net, but often the county clerk date stamped copy is not submitted in our applications, and we can't look up a record of that filing. As I mentioned, if the state water board is CEQA lead, we have our own NOE templates, and we'll take care of drafting and filing the NOE. And then recall, in the environmental package, there was a note about supporting documentation for NOEs. So this is going to depend on the project scope. If bio and cultural reports were completed for a project, for example, that can help support the exemption, as long as obviously there's no impacts identified there. If no other documentation exists, at a minimum, we're probably going to need like a really accurate project description, maybe like including a map if that's available, and some photos of the project area. And we need this information so that we can determine if we agree with the exemption and to document the decision-making process behind exempting the project. And a note on statutory exemptions. So this is a little bit weird, but the state water board cannot apply a statutory exemption to a project that must meet federal requirements. This is because our review must be equivalent to NEPA or a NEPA review. And basically we use CEQA and the federal cross-cutter documents to meet this NEPA equivalency requirement. Generally, there is not a NEPA categorical exclusion that is equivalent to most CEQA statutory exemptions. So other agencies can still use statutory exemptions, but there may be issues if the state water board can't apply a categorical exemption to that project. So for example, we had a project where the lead agency statutorily exempted the project, but they had identified some potential impacts and they included some mitigation measures in the project. Because there were mitigation measures included, the state water board couldn't categorically exempt the project, and it caused a lot of problems during the environmental review. And you may have heard about SB 974. I think this is currently pending the governor's approval, but this is a bill that would exempt water projects meeting certain criteria for disadvantaged communities. I believe I believe this would be considered a statutory exemption if it gets approved or once it gets approved. So that means the state water board would not be able to apply it to federally funded projects. So the bottom line here is if you're working on a project and it looks like a statutory exemption might apply, get in touch with us just to make sure that there won't be any issues. Okay, let's talk about non-exempt projects. So this is kind of general CEQA stuff. Make sure if you're using the CEQA guidelines Appendix G template that you're using the most updated version. We've had some CEQA documents come in recently that have outdated checklist questions, and there are some substantial changes, I would say, in the 2018 update, such as like how transportation impacts are handled. It's quite different now. And this is also pretty normal CEQA, but make sure to include a background, an environmental setting, or an environmental baseline in your CEQA documents, as well as a clear discussion of each of the initial study checklist items and supporting analysis. And then hopefully everyone knows, but the state clearinghouse is moving to an all online submission process. So starting on November 3rd, all CEQA documentation will need to be submitted through their CEQA submit portal. I would highly recommend reading their user guide. You have to be registered to submit CEQA documents through the portal, and it's a little bit of a process to get going. And the other important thing is this means CEQA documents have to meet the accessibility requirements of AB 434. So this essentially requires compliance with web content accessibility guidelines. There's a link at the bottom of the slide to version 2.0. I would recommend getting familiar with these guidelines since essentially everything will need to meet these requirements going forward. And here is that list of required CEQA documentation from section 5 of the environmental package that we saw earlier. So these are all normal CEQA components. There's a few that are often missing from our applications, however. So like comments and responses, resolution or the meeting minutes adopting the CEQA document, and a record of filing the NOD at like the local county clerk or possibly state clearinghouse. These pieces are commonly like left out of our applications. So make sure that these documents are included in the final environmental package. You may need to work with your TA provider and the lead agency to get copies of like adoption documents or meeting minutes and that kind of thing. Okay, let's cover the State Water Board as CEQA lead. So when is the State Water Board the CEQA lead agency? Generally, when the applicant is a private water system and when no discretionary permits from a public agency are necessary for the project. If you think this is the case, start coordinating with us right away so that we can be involved in the process just as early as possible. The State Water Board needs to initiate tribal outreach for AB 52 prior to the CEQA document being developed. And we don't use the Native American Heritage Commission list for this. We often have, we have our own internal list, and often when consultants do tribal outreach prior to coordinating with us, we have to resend AB 52 letters to tribes. Also, obviously, the State Water Board will need to review the draft CEQA documents. This will probably take a couple of weeks at minimum, I would guess, and it's much easier to plan for this review if we know about the project in advance. The State Water Board doesn't have a specific initial study template, so we're okay with using whatever format as long as there's an adequate environmental setting and analysis of project impacts. We will most likely require some type of bio and or cultural report to support the initial study, even if federal crosscutters are not required for the project. Lisa touched on that for the cultural report earlier. And then, like we just talked about, make sure that the document meets the web content accessibility guidelines that I discussed a slide or two ago. When the State Water Board is CEQA lead agency, the environmental consultant will need to draft the CEQA document, obviously, respond to any comments from State Water Board environmental staff, coordinate throughout the public circulation process. We may need assistance with like local NOI postings or coordinating document submittals, and then respond to any comments received as part of the public circulation process. Generally, the State Water Board will prepare the notice of intent, the notice of completion, and notice of determination for the project. We either have our own templates for these or we will use the state clearinghouse ones. So these don't need to be drafted and submitted to us, although I guess if they are prepared by the consultant, we can use those as well. We may need some help with the local NOI postings, as I mentioned earlier. And the State Water Board will also submit the CEQA document to the state clearinghouse for circulation, and will obviously take care of adopting the CEQA document and filing the NOD. So when the State Water Board is CEQA lead, this will change what attachments are submitted with the environmental package. No NOEs or NODs, no adoption resolution or meeting minutes, etc. Red here is what the consultant will need to prepare, and blue is what the State Water Board will prepare. Blue items do not need to be a part of the TA work plan scope if the State Water Board is CEQA lead. And our process for approving projects is a little weird. We don't actually approve the project internally until we are issuing a funding agreement for the construction project. So this means we usually wrap up the TA work plan and adopt the CEQA document, but we won't actually approve the project and file our NOD until a while later when the funding agreement is actually issued. This is an air quality section from an example State Water Board CEQA lead M&D. I just include this to show the background, environmental setting, or environmental baseline, as well as a clear discussion of each of the initial study checklist items. And this is the rest of that example. Here you can see the consultant incorporated the air quality table from section 4 of the environmental package into the air quality section of the CEQA document. And the project emissions here, I believe they're calculated with CaliMod. So here's a few tips just for streamlining the CEQA process. The biggest delays come from changes in the project scope after the CEQA document has been drafted. So try to make sure the project scope is as complete as possible before drafting the CEQA document. Obviously, this may not be under your control depending on the status of the plans and specs, but I think it's important to keep in mind. And also, if the scope changes, we might need new surveys, or documents might need to be recirculated, addendums might need to be prepared. CEQA addendums in particular are a bit more complicated than you may be used to because of some federal requirements. I'll discuss this in a couple of slides. Communication, again, is key. Check in with your TA provider and make sure to keep them updated on the status of any environmental documents. If you need information for the project, work with your TA provider to request it from the project engineer or the applicant. If other agencies are involved, start consulting early. Often delays are caused because we need another agency to weigh in on the project. And please involve the State Water Board in meetings with other agencies. We might need to discuss who the CEQA lead agency is or coordinate on federal requirements. Make sure that there's enough time in the TA work plan for the public comment period and for responding to comments, and also for the lead agency to adopt the CEQA document and file their NOD. If there isn't, or if it looks like there isn't, then notify your TA provider. And then lastly, here's just a few reasons to coordinate with the State Water Board early on in the process. If the State Water Board is likely the CEQA lead agency, if there are questions about SRF requirements that may affect CEQA, or if there's uncertainty about a project being CEQA exempt. So if any of these are the case, please reach out to us. Okay, so far what I've been talking about has mostly been normal for CEQA, but I want to highlight some of the common ways that federal requirements affect the CEQA process. I already went over the potential issues with statutory exemptions when talking about NOEs. State Water Board can't apply them to federal projects. The SRF regulations require a 5-year reevaluation for projects. So basically, if a CEQA document was adopted by the lead agency more than 5 years before the State Water Board issues a funding agreement for the project, we have to reevaluate that project. This means some type of documentation has to be prepared, whether that's a memo to file, just affirming that the project scope hasn't changed and the environmental analysis is still accurate, or an addendum that evaluates changes in the project scope. So there's currently guidance, it's a flowchart for this requirement for the Clean Water Program. We just recently received the approved state environmental review process for the drinking water program from EPA, and it has a couple differences with how we go about this. So we're currently developing new guidance that incorporates those changes. I don't think this 5-year requirement will come up often in TA projects, but it might. So I wanted to bring it up so you're aware. And subsequent CEQA documents and addendums. So the SRF regulations include formal public comment period requirements. Subsequent CEQA documents just need to follow the CEQA guidelines requirements for public circulation, and that should check both boxes. But addendums require either posting or circulation at the state clearinghouse. As I mentioned, this is changing for drinking water because of the new state environmental review process, but the guidance that we're working on for the 5-year requirement should also cover our process for addendums. So the current clean water process requires posting at the state clearinghouse for addendums if the project has not changed, and circulation through the state clearinghouse if the project scope has changed, along with some other requirements like considering any comments received and that kind of thing. So essentially what you need to know is that for federally funded SRF projects, addendums can't just be drafted and added to the project file. There's a little bit more to it. And then I touched on the public meeting requirement earlier. Drinking water requires a public meeting for EIRs. This should happen under the normal CEQA process anyway, but clean water requires a public meeting for any projects that are not CEQA exempt. What if federal crosscutters do not apply? So some projects may not require environmental crosscutters. This needs to be confirmed with the grant manager and or the project manager at the State Water Board. If this is the case, the biggest thing is Section 4 of the environmental package does not need to be completed. It can just be left blank. And no federal crosscutter attachments for Section 4 are necessary. So this includes the bio and cultural reports and the air quality analysis, as well as any other attachments. But obviously, these reports and studies may still be necessary in order to support the CEQA document. So if crosscutters do not apply, these reports don't need to have like that specific federal language, but they might still need to be developed just to adequately support the initial study. And as Lisa mentioned, for example, if the State Water Board is CEQA lead agency, we are most likely going to request these reports just to support the CEQA document. And lastly, if crosscutters don't apply, none of the things that affect CEQA processes from the previous slide would happen. So like the 5-year reaffirmation process or the addendum requirements, they would not apply. Simple projects. If you're working on a simple project and you're trying to figure out what environmental documentation is necessary, there's really 2 main questions you need to ask. So number 1 is, does this project have to meet federal requirements? Hopefully the scope of the TA work plan should tell you this, but if there's any confusion about it, like work with your TA provider so that you can get a clear answer. And if yes, regardless of the CEQA process, federal crosscutter documentation is likely going to be necessary. This obviously depends on some specific project details as we've discussed in the rest of this presentation. And if no, the normal CEQA process applies. And then question number 2 is, can an exemption apply to the project? If yes, what documentation do we need to support the exemption? And if no, we're in the realm of developing an initial study like normal. Okay, some general recommendations. So the most successful technical assistance projects have really frequent communication between consultants, providers, and state water board staff. If you have questions about the environmental requirements, work with your TA provider to get in touch with the state water board, and we can help clarify or review the project or documents. As we've discussed, there are a lot of requirements and like weird nuances in our environmental review process, and we would much rather catch any issues sooner rather than later. Review documents prepared by subconsultants before submitting them. Keep in mind, all of these technical reports, bioculture reports, that kind of thing, they're all related to the CEQA process. So for example, if you think a project is exempt, that needs to be supported by the rest of the documentation. I'll say like a really common situation that we see, at least in the drinking water program, is a quote unquote simple project, and we're assuming it's going to be CEQA exempt. But then we get to reviewing the bioculture report, and it turns out that it identifies impacts and proposes mitigation measures. So now the exemption may not be applicable because we need to mitigate potential impacts. Or we'll get like a technical report that recommends certain conservation measures, but then when we go to review the CEQA document, those measures aren't included in the actual CEQA document itself. When we review these applications and these documents, we're cross-referencing them to make sure that they support one another. So if you're subcontracting environmental work, make sure you review what's produced and that it supports or at least doesn't contradict the other environmental documentation. Keep federal cross-cutter procedures separate from CEQA. So a lot of these environmental documents can combine language to meet both federal and state requirements. That's totally fine. It's fine to include cross-cutter information in the CEQA document, such as like maybe attaching a bio report that was prepared also to meet Section 7 requirements, attaching that like as an appendix to an M&D, but don't include statements in the CEQA document itself that assume federal cross-cutters will apply to the project. And in particular, do not include references to federal consultation in mitigation measures, conservation measures, or best management practices. The reason for this is, even if we think cross-cutters will apply to a project when the CEQA document is drafted, this may change prior to the State Water Board funding the project, and we don't want to have outdated language or commitments included in the CEQA document. And then this is more of a personal preference for myself, I suppose, but generally I find it easier to have environmental documents submitted separately for review, just in case revisions are needed. Otherwise, we wind up with certain documents being combined with outdated versions of other documents, and it can be difficult to keep track of everything. These are just a few more resources you can check out if you would like. All of these are linked from the environmental section website, which is the top link on this slide. And as I mentioned, the Drinking Water SRF State Environmental Review Process, or SERP, it's recently been approved by EPA. I don't believe it's online yet, but hopefully soon. And here are the contacts that we've gone over in this presentation. I am always super happy to help answer questions, but feel free to reach out to Bridget or Brian with general questions as well. And again, Lisa and Wendy are the contacts for cultural questions. And a reminder, if you're asking questions about a specific project, please include your TA provider and grant manager in the conversations so that they're aware of the status. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time. And I think we're going to open this up for questions now. So I'll turn this back over to Ibyan.
Okay, if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll call on you in the order that we see hands raised. I don't have any questions in my inbox, so I'm assuming if there's questions, they'll be asked by raising hands. If not, you could send an email to Ibyan, IBYANG .Rivera, RIVERA @waterboards.ca.gov. And again, this training is being recorded, so we will make that available on our technical assistance webpage in the near future. So if you'd like to watch it one more time, maybe you missed the answer to your question, you could do that as well. Okay. Gabriel and Lisa, I don't see any questions. Do we want to wait a couple minutes to give people some time?
We can wait, or also, I mean, if people have specific questions, like I said, feel free to just send us emails or send an email to Ibian. She can forward it along and we can respond to general questions, or if you have project specific things, feel free to send those along as well.
Okay, I don't see any questions, so I think that concludes our training. And so with that said, I want to thank Gabriel and Lisa for their time in preparing this presentation, giving the presentation. Now we all know a little bit more about what to look for in these environmental packages and documents and where to find resources and who your resources are if you have questions. So one quick announcement, we have the fourth training in the Training for TA Providers series scheduled for next Wednesday. That is on the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund application. And that's Wednesday, the 30th, between 1 and 3 p.m. So if you have already RSVP'd, we'll be sending out the meeting appointment later this week or early next week. Thanks again for attending today's training. We appreciate your time. If you have any additional questions, you can direct them to ibian.rivera@waterboards.ca.gov or to the grant manager assigned to the provider, or to one of the contacts that Gabriel and Lisa had mentioned in this training. I noticed Kim is there. Kim, would you like to speak? I'm going to unmute you. Maybe, or not.
Hi, thank you, Ibian. This is Kim Din with the Small Community Technical Assistance Unit. And thank you, Gabriel and Lisa, Bridget, and the team to provide this training to our TA providers, consultants. And, we really appreciate that. We hope that with the training, we will have a better coordinations with the TA providers and the consultants. Thank you for your time spending, attending this training. Hopefully it's going to be helpful for you guys to get the documents to us and get more details, information if you don't already know. And this is not only affecting, the work that you do under our technical assistance providers, but also, in the work that you do in our regular funding project as well. So thank you for attending.
With that, I want to say thank you for your time and have a good afternoon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.